Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. There's been a lot of talk the last week about Prince Harry and Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex, planning on probably moving to Canada. And a lot of interest in what that might mean for us as a country. And so I thought I'd dig in a little bit about what that could mean for us, given that we are a constitutional monarchy. One of the first things to remember is that even though Harry is the grandson of the Queen and seventh in line currently for the throne, he doesn't actually have a constitutional position in Canada. The way Canadian constitutional monarchy laws are structured are basically that the Queen is the only recognized member of the royal family in Canada, and all members of her family are treated in a somewhat honorary capacity, but they don't have any kind of legal weight or position under our laws. So that kind of limits what he is able to do in any kind of position, simply being the grandson of the Queen under our laws. Now, there are things that we could do around that, and there have been a lot of suggestions, such as making him the Governor General, or in some more specious suggestions that, we amend the laws of succession in order to make Harry the next king. And I figured let's talk about a couple of those and what it might mean. The only real barrier to Harry becoming Governor General is more convention than anything else. It used to be fairly commonplace that relatives of the Queen back in the 19th century would be given these kinds of Governor General positions, but that was at a time when we were, essentially colonies, and they were agents of the British state. It didn't have the same kind of relationship between Parliament and the Prime Minister that the current Governor General does. In fact, that back in the day, the Governor General would have to go through the Foreign Office in the UK in order to communicate with someone who could communicate with the Queen, whereas these days there's a fairly direct line between Rideau Hall and Buckingham Palace. So that's part of the first thing. We have essentially Canadianized the institution since the end of the First World War. We've begun appointing governors general who are Canadian by birth and not British, and really kind of ensuring that there's Canadian aspects to it, such as, we kind of switch between French and English governors general, and that there's some more kind of Canadian representativeness of it. And we've kind of gotten into a bit of a habit, so to speak, in terms of choosing governors general who we think are representative of the country in certain ways. And we can think of governors general like Michaëlle Jean as an example of wanting to showcase someone who's accomplished and who came to Canada as a refugee, and how that reflects on us as a country. I don't know that we have any particular symbolism that's meaningful to Canada out of Harry's appointment. On top of the fact that we don't really have any indications that he is functionally bilingual enough for the position, because that's a pretty important thing for Canada in the modern sense, as well as the fact that we really should be thinking of governors general as people who've had long and distinguished careers, and this kind of caps it off. We have had younger governor generals in the past, but in the modern era, the youngest was in his 40s, and that's had a bit of, it was a bit controversial at the time, and there have been a number of reasonable criticisms that Some governments have appointed governors general who are too young, and it creates a problem when they need something to do after that job is up. And what can they do, and what what can they be looking for that's not going to cause problems with the image of the Governor General's office in general if they start taking on a role that's too big P political. And we can think, for example, of former Governor General Ed Schreier, who ran for office after being Governor General, and he didn't get in, but it does create problems with perception. The thought of Harry as a future King of Canada is something that I don't know that anyone necessarily takes seriously, but some people seem to think that he would be, because he was the fun one, that it would somehow, be a good thing for the country. This is something that theoretically could happen because Canada doesn't necessarily have proper laws around the lines of succession that other countries in the same Commonwealth do. And that is in part because we had a certain number of, we'll call them constitutional fudges in the past few years. Going back to the Statute of Westminster in the 1930s, we had started moving on the path of creating a more separate legal structure around succession in Canada, particularly around the abdication of Edward VIII, which gave us the current Queen in the wake of that. However, what has happened in recent years is that when the rest of the Commonwealth was passing laws relating to getting rid of male primogeniture, which meant that only males were preferred in the line of succession, that instead of looking to do a constitutional amendment, which was probably what should have happened in Canada, because the office of the Queen is covered in the Constitution as something that requires unanimous consent of the provinces in order to change, the government of the day decided to fudge it and say, we'll just go with what Britain's decided. And two courts now have upheld that particular decision. We'll see if the Supreme Court will uphold it. There's a good chance that they won't, or they will decide not to touch the topic given the unanimous consent or decision of the Quebec Court of Appeal on that. So that's kind of set us up in a bit of a situation where we are somewhat colonial again, because we don't have, we've essentially ceded control over our own monarch, which is kind of a funny thing to do for a country like ours, which had a long road towards, severing those kinds of ties and ensuring that, the Crown of Canada was separate and distinct from the Crown of the UK. Now, because of these particular fudges, it's quite theoretical that we could, by a simple act of Parliament, put Harry into the line of succession for when the Queen passes. But that, would likely be challenged, and we might have to undo all of the fudges that we've done so far. But that possibility does exist. As with making Harry the Governor General, I'm not sure that it's really a good fit for reasons like bilingualism and so on. But I mean, we also have to remember that Harry does have a bit of a problematic past with racist statements and that, party where he wore a Nazi uniform at, and things like that, without necessarily demonstrating enough humility over those incidents or gravitas around them. And, I'm not sure that that he would acquit himself as a King of Canada better than, for example, Prince Charles will when he accedes to the throne. So those are some things to think about as we kind of somewhat seriously debate what kind of a role Harry might play if he decides to start living in Canada on a more full-time basis. I have a piece out in Maclean's right now which posits that perhaps we can put him to work in other ways around things like royal patronages in this country, which means, you know, having someone from the royal family who lends their name to different institutions or charitable causes and, you know, tries to give them some exposure and so on. This is a fairly common practice in the UK. It does happen in Canada, but not often enough, in part because we had a fairly haphazard system around that. And it wasn't until a few years ago that we actually came up with a more formalized process around that. So we've got that in place. And if we've got a royal who's spending more than half of the year in the country, that'd be a fairly good opportunity to try and reinvigorate that kind of a system. And on top of that, the current Governor General is, you know, has kind of given up a lot of the patronages that her office normally would do. There were about 250 different organizations for whom the Governor General would provide some kind of a patronage role. And Julie Payette has somewhat stepped away from many of those. And so there is a need for that in this country. And if we've got Harry here, you know, more than half the year at a time, then that would be a pretty good way to try and get him involved in civil society in Canada. And, you know, still playing a royal role, but one that can be a little more focused on Canada. And that, I think, would be a pretty good compromise, assuming that all of the details get worked out with what kind of a role he's going to play with the Queen in Buckingham Palace in the weeks to come. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.